Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Night Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics spring meeting from Indianapolis, Indiana, and welcome to those who are here live as well as those who are joining us virtually. Today's first session, we have the privilege of being joined by NCAA President Charlie Baker, the sixth president of the NCAA, who began his term just a little over 2 years ago, and I'm sure it seems like eons, but happy to have you here.
Amy said they were dog years.
Yeah. Well, certainly much has transpired in that short period of time, and we're pleased that you're able to join us today. You know, obviously Division I sports is experiencing the most significant changes in its history, and we look forward to President Baker's remarks. And then we're going to take questions from the commission members seated around the table. But first, a few housekeeping points as we begin this session. This session is being recorded. Recorded video and other meeting materials will be available on nightcommission.org. We have a large virtual audience and commission members and panelists. Hopefully you guys will use your microphones when speaking so that the virtual audience can hear you. And so with that said, President Baker, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Len, and thank you all for the opportunity to be here. And by the way, thanks very much for having your meeting in Indianapolis, which of course is the home of the NCAA. I thought what I might do is give you a brief sort of retrospective on my first 2 years and then talk a little bit about some of the stuff that is more forward-looking. The first thing I did when I got the job, which was literally March, I got started in March of 23, was did a procurement to determine if we could find a consultant to help us sort of do a state of the play for the NCAA and college sports. Bain ended up winning that state of the play and gave us, I think, a pretty decent roadmap about how to think about where the opportunities resided and where our best chances to make a difference were going forward. And I won't get into all the details in that, but they basically said, there are a bunch of ways you could enhance and improve the quality and the experience that student athletes have in championships. There are a bunch of things you could do to enhance your revenue base and reduce your costs, thereby making it possible to put more money back to the schools, which I think, as most people know, is typically used primarily for scholarships of one kind or another. And to take seriously the move away from cable and broadcast and to digital and start thinking about what an NCAA digital strategy might look like. And we took all that pretty seriously. And over the course of the past couple of years, significantly enhanced our revenue base, created for the first time a fan database, which I'll talk about more in a second, but currently has about 15 million fans in it, and has tremendous applications in all kinds of ways, and did some things to sort of reorganize the way we operated in Indianapolis and to extend our sort of footprint out to a lot of the membership. I made a decision at that point to start meeting with every conference every year. My original goal was to meet with all 97 conferences in my first 100 days. That was obviously stupid. I did get to all 97 of them in my first 150 days or so, and have managed to meet either in person or virtually with every conference every year. And those direct conversations with whoever the conference decides to bring to the conversation. Sometimes it's presidents, sometimes it's presidents and ADs and coaches and students, sometimes it's coaches, students, and ADs. My view on this is they can bring anybody they want. I just want to be able to hear what they have to say and let me know what they think their biggest challenges are and where we can be most helpful. There are a number of things we've ended up doing that came about as a result of some of that. One of the biggest ones was the agreement we established with RefQuest to help us access more officials. One of the things we heard a lot from schools across all three divisions was the challenges associated with accessing officiating. It's obvious you can't have a game if you don't have officials. And so we did a couple things on this. The RefQuest thing probably brought somewhere between 15 and 20,000 officials who we did not have access to previously into our orbit. And by bringing them into our orbit, they obviously brought them into the orbits of schools in divisions 3, 2, and 1. And they have been pretty active in supporting schools and conferences in various sports across all 3 divisions since we partnered with them. The other thing that was interesting about this is we did a survey of officials generally, and while they certainly would like to be paid more, and while they certainly believe their travel requirements in some cases are significant, the single biggest reason that folks who officiating left was online and in-person abuse from coaches, fans, parents, sort of the rest of the world that cares about college sports. And I continue to think that this is going to end up, with respect to that issue, being a major challenge, but it's also something that's a major challenge in other places in college sports. Before I actually started, but after my appointment was announced, I visited with about 1,000 student athletes around the general New England region, which is where I'm from, and just talked to them about what was up, what was going on, what was working, what wasn't, and virtually all of them talked about online and in-person, in-game abuse, bullying, whatever you want to call it. And I think a lot of it, for many of them, they believed was related to sports betting. And they told me lots of stories about, the typical story was some version of classmates, schoolmates, friends, basically saying to them, I lost a lot of money over the past few weeks betting on sports. And, if you just swing at the first pitch, miss your first free throw, don't catch the first pass, what I refer to as sort of the negative side of prop bets, I could make back a lot of the money I lost, and that would be really helpful. And obviously, student athletes don't like the idea of being approached to begin with around that kind of an issue. And they especially don't like the idea of being nudged into doing something that is not in the best interests of themselves or their teams. And more importantly, they all made clear to me that they felt enormous social pressure to, quote, help a guy out. And because of that, we did a survey shortly after I got the job on sports betting for 18 to 22-year-olds. And it basically showed that it was a lot more, there's a lot more of it going on, I think, than most people realize. North of 50% of everybody between the ages of 18 and 22 had bet recently on sports. The number for those on college campuses was higher. And it really didn't matter where you lived. The activity in states where sports betting wasn't legal was just as high as it was in states where it was. And most states, the age to participate is 21, but the kids who are 18, 19, and 20 were betting at the same rates as the kids who were 21 and 22. So we spent a fair amount of time developing some strategies around this, and they involved 3 things. Number one, finding a partner to help us track abuse online, especially at our sporting events and our championships, and making sure that we had the ability to access platforms and to shut people off if they were engaged in really bad behavior with respect to our student athletes. And we actually published that data. We put out a fairly significant package of data last year about this time relating to our winter championships, and you're probably going to see something from us in the not too distant future for this year's championships. And to make the case to the public and to others that that the online abuse is real. It's in many cases related to betting. It's related to all sorts of other things too. There's a lot of just hugely bad behavior, I think, as everybody knows, in the social media space to begin with. But the public square that so many student athletes live in has translated for them in many cases into a really tough place to play. And I do think we took a run at a bunch of the state gaming authorities to see if we could get some of them to peel back their rules around prop betting on college sports. And we managed to get 4 or 5 of them to do that. there were a bunch that had done it already. I think at this point, slightly more than half of the states that have legalized sports betting do not permit prop betting on college sports. But that still leaves enormous numbers of student athletes subject to the kind of abuse that comes with this stuff. And I think it will remain, for all intents and purposes, a significant challenge going forward. We did engage a contract negotiation with a company called Genius Sports, which provides live stats to our membership around performance in the regular season and in the postseason. And I negotiated a deal with them where going forward, the sports books, for them to continue to access our data going forward, there can't be any sports book betting on negative props. So all of the stuff that literally translates into a lot of the worst of the behavior that's directed at young people and student athletes generally under this agreement is going to be off the table. And that takes more than half of the traffic associated with this out. And we'll continue to work the gaming commissions and we'll continue to talk to the feds about it to see if we can get something done about the other side of prop bets. But there's no point or purpose for prop bets in college sports. In my view, they send all the wrong messages and they create an enormous amount of really nasty traffic that's directed at young people who don't deserve it. We also made some decisions based on some of the work that was done by the consultant we hired, but also just based on conversations to create a post-eligibility health insurance program for student athletes across all three divisions. That program's up and operating. It is being managed for us by the same organization that manages our catastrophic injury program. So if a student athlete who is still in treatment when they leave school accesses this program, if they hit I hope nobody does, but if they hit the $95,000 cost mark, they will automatically just convert into the catastrophic insurance program seamlessly because it's run by the same carrier. I think this is a big win for kids. It's a big win, not only for them as student athletes, but also because this makes it possible for them to deal with whatever circumstances or situation they might have that isn't covered by their college once they leave school. We also got commitments from the D1 schools to provide core guarantees around scholarships and mental health and health services. And that scholarship guarantee lasts 10 years if that's what it takes for you to get your degree. And it can't be taken away from you if you choose not to play. And we spend a lot of time paying attention to that one and tracking it. And we talk to a lot of student athletes about it. And I think in the world we currently live in with, court-ordered changes in transfer policy and that sort of thing, this becomes especially important. The fan database, I don't want to spend too much time on this unless you do, but I think it has a lot of possibilities. And I say that because most people track and follow college sports generally on their phone. And if you're not on their phone, then to some extent you don't exist. And I think so where do we get our 15 million fans from? Tickets, social media traffic on our sites, other engagement, whether it's brackets or other stuff where people have engaged with the NCAA. And we're now sort of filling in some of the other gaps. We know their email address. We know what championships they attended. That tells us a little bit about what teams they're interested in. And it also tells us a little bit about where they're from. And we're now working with schools to do data exchanges with some of their ticket data to both help them understand more about their fan database, but also help us understand more about ours. And I won't get into all the details here, but we've done some data matches with some schools and have figured out that we know more about some of these fans than our schools do, and our schools know more about some of them than we do. And And I really do think over time, this thing can become an incredibly powerful tool to do a number of things. Number one, bring visibility and attention to all college sports. One of the schools we did one of these data matches with, we were able to sort of pinpoint for them that they had tens of thousands of fans of their school's sports in volleyball and women's basketball and softball and swimming. And I think one of the things that our data has that makes it particularly interesting is it tracks our championships, which is there's 97 of them. So we have a very broad portfolio of experiences that we're collecting data for. And my goal is to get to around 25 million. And at the end of the day, what I want to be able to do with this ultimately is to not just provide, additional ways for us to communicate content and interesting stuff to people who care about college sports, and then to let them know when there are games in their area we think they might be interested in attending, or games in sports that they're interested in that they might want to view. I also think it's the kind of thing we can start to use to support, and we tried this and our open rates were ridiculous, for conference championships, key rivalry games, stuff like that. And if you really believe, as we do, that our presence on social media is going to be a big part of how we stay in touch with our fans, this is probably one of the biggest and best opportunities we have to drive attendance and viewership to all college sports, which I think over time is going to be a really important element in creating revenue opportunities for, quote, all college sports as well. Not just ours, not just the championships, but the rest of college sports as well. And I think sometimes one of the biggest challenges we face in this area is not that there aren't fans out there, but not having an organized way to actually get to them and to let them know where the opportunities are and what sports they might be interested in following, that we have the capacity to connect with them on. I do want to talk a little bit about the settlement, although it's still a work in process. So there may be some things I just don't talk about, which I'm sure you can understand. The original, we can debate about where the original idea for this whole idea of creating an institutional NIL program came from. I can just tell you that it was something I proposed in the fall of 23, about 6 months after I got the job. We track transfers pretty carefully, and we track kids who go in the portal pretty carefully. And while student athletes actually transfer less than non-student athletes, and this is one contextual piece of this story that always gets lost, about a third of all the kids who go to four-year colleges now transfer at least once. The percentage of kids who transfer who play college sports is significantly below that. But obviously it's a much bigger number than it was 10 years ago. But we live in a world where kids have access to information and knowledge about what's going on campuses around them that just didn't exist 10 years ago. And it's definitely had an impact on the decisions they make about whether they want to stay at the place they're at or go somewhere else. And, Peter, this is probably too long ago for it to matter. But when you and I were in college, the only way we knew what was going on somebody else's campus was probably writing letters. Sometimes you get access to the dorm phone, probably not. And if you did, you couldn't really make a long distance phone call unless you knew how to pay for it. And I know we're laughing, but it's true. And yeah, exactly. So and by the way, schools were bursting at that point too. You and I are right in the middle of the baby boom generation, and there wasn't an empty seat anywhere in America. We're now in a very different place where schools have empty seats. The 18-year-old population has been declining for a while, and the access to information that kids have is extraordinary. So the transfer portal, to some extent, is has a lot to do with a bunch of things that are going on in college sports, but it also has a lot to do with what's going on with college students generally. And I think we need to keep that in mind. But one of the things about our tracking of this stuff that is disturbing is somewhere around a third of the kids who go in the portal, we have trouble finding. Now, I've managed to talk to some of those kids, and most of them tell me a story that's pretty similar, which is they got in the portal because somebody told them there was an opportunity for them, and then there wasn't. And I think it's one of the things I have not liked very much about the way the current system works is most of the people who are talking to these kids, most of the people who are engaging with them are really not accountable to anybody, and there's no real process to make them accountable. One of the things I appreciate about the settlement is it moves the center of gravity from third parties that are sort of tangentially and theoretically kind of sort of attached to schools and institutions, but not really and aren't known. It moves the center of gravity to the schools. And I think that's where it belongs. I think we're far more likely to have what I would describe as real engagement and reputational support for and process transparency and accountability if most of the activity that's going on in the NIL space is school-based. I also think the settlement, because of the way it's organized, creates a dynamic where you have 5 defendants, the NCAA, and the 6 defendants, and the 5 traditional power conferences, and the plaintiff attorneys and the special master that would be appointed by the court overseeing the process associated with how it's working to make sure that it actually works the way it's intended to work on both the institutional NIL piece and on the third-party NIL piece. And in both cases, there will be rules and there will be processes to both file things, have them get approved, and we will, for the first time ever, actually be able to publish in the aggregate data about what's really going on. I don't believe anything anybody tells me or says about what's going on in the NIL space because there's no way to verify any of it. And my favorite comment on this came from, I actually had several reporters tell me that they don't write about NIL because they don't believe anything they hear, which I thought was pretty compelling. But I also really appreciated Arch Manning's grandfather's comment on this. Pretty smart guy, been around a long time, who when asked at the bowl game last year about Arch Manning's $2 million NIL deal, basically said, quote, "That's BS. I don't believe a word about anything anybody says about NIL." And that one in particular is also not true. I mean, in the absence of any data, people will believe practically anything or not believe practically anything. But the bottom line is the settlement will create for the first time accountability processes, transparency around what's going on, and real data about what's happening. And it will give the schools back some of the opportunity to engage their student athletes that they've lost. And I think in some ways that's the most valuable and important element to the whole thing. The one other thing I would say about the settlement is I think less than 1% of the kids who were part of the class objected. The number of student athletes who signed up on the back damage piece is enormous. And that's a $2.86 billion payment over 10 years. In the first year of that, the NCAA's national office, I think primarily because a lot of the work we've done around revenue and spending is contributing 175 million of that 286 million. First year payment, 10 years, divided by 10, 286 is the number. That's 61% of the total. And I'm hopeful that as we go forward, the national office will be able to take some of the hit away from the schools on that by continuing to make a significant contribution to that every year. But in some respects, it's a critically important part of the settlement. And the fact that so many of the student athletes who are part of that class signed up for it, I thought was a very positive sign about the way they viewed it. The final thing I'll mention quickly is I also think creating that structure and doing it within what will hopefully be an injunctive framework creates for the first time a more defensible approach to managing NIL than we have now. And remains to be seen how that all plays out. If it happens, judge still hasn't rendered a decision, but I certainly think the possibility there to reduce some of the litigation, which, when we hired Bain to do that consulting report for us, they covered a lot of stuff. But the degree of litigious activity that was going on out there in the courts was not one of the things that was on their radar. Certainly wasn't on mine. And I do think it creates tremendous uncertainty for everybody about what the role and the future of college sports is actually going to be. And it would be really helpful if we could find a way to put some of that stuff behind us. And I'll stop there.
Well, that was a great presentation for us to kind of get started. As mentioned before, hopefully you'll be pleased to field some questions from the commission. And as the co-chair, I'll take co-chair prerogative and ask the first question. As leader of the NCAA, you serve over 1,000 member institutions. What is the vision? What do you want college athletics to look like in 5 years? And what role should the NCAA play?
I mean, my vision is that we should work with our member institutions to provide young people with the best experience we possibly can playing college sports. I do not believe that college sports gets anywhere near the credit it deserves for the educational and developmental opportunities that come from being on a team. And I also don't think most people appreciate necessarily that whether you're playing D1, D2, or D3, you're one of 7% of the kids who played high school sports who's actually still playing sports in college. I mean, I look at my kids' D3 football teams. They played at Denison and Union. Virtually every kid on that team was all league, and many of them were all state. So I talk to kids a lot. Everywhere I go, I talk to kids. Anytime I get to a campus, anytime I go to one of our tournaments, one of the requirements is I want to talk to young people. And I was at one gathering with a group of student athletes, and I was just taking questions on whatever they wanted to talk about. And one of them asked me how they could translate what they've learned and what they've done as a student athlete in a job interview. And I said, "So, do you think you're a pretty good teammate?" "Oh yeah, of course. Yeah. You can put your interests aside in pursuit of the larger goal of the team you're on." "Of course. Yeah. Everybody does that." "Are you capable of taking constructive criticism without having a tantrum?" "Yeah. I mean, you can't get better if you're not willing to have people tell you what you're doing well and what you're not doing well." "Can you deliver constructive criticism to your peers in a way that they will, engage you with and accept that from your dialogue?" "Well, yeah, of course." When you lose, when you get pushed down, when you get beaten, can you get back up the next day and come right at it again with the same enthusiasm you had the day before?" "Of course. Yeah." I mean, she literally got to the point where she was annoyed that I was asking her what were obvious questions. And the final one I asked her was, I said, "Do you think you can get better without doing the grind? Do you think it's possible for somebody to just be good enough?" And she said, "Of course not. I mean, if you really want to be good in a sport, you compete with other kids who are working just as hard or harder than you. And besides, if you want to serve your teammates and your coach and your school the way you want to do that, you have to be willing to do the grind." And I looked at her, I just said, "Just say all those things. That's all you need to do." And I continue to believe, and that she's not the only one I had that conversation with, but the point is, there is educational and developmental value in playing a sport that I think is wildly underappreciated. And so for me, goal number one is I want as many opportunities for young people to play sports as possible. Okay. You said 10 years from now, Len, right? So we're going to assume all the legal issues are done. Are we going to just assume that? I think settling those, as much of the legal stuff as we possibly can, I think is really important. And some of that I'm hoping we'll be able to do through the courts. I hope we can deal with some of the other issues at the federal level. We'll see about that. I think continuing to give kids the best experience we possibly can in our championships is really important. We do surveys every year on what people think across all three divisions, and we've made a lot of adjustments based on that, and we'll continue to do that going forward. I really think putting fans in the stands and viewers on the streaming platforms or whatever, I think that's something we need to be as aggressive as we can be. I've talked to a lot of kids who made very clear to me that they want to play in a full house. If they're playing in a tournament, they make it to the regionals, the super regionals, quarterfinals, Final Four, whatever. They want to play in front of a full house, and they think we should help make that happen. And I agree. And I think the health and safety stuff, particularly in this day and age, needs to continue to be a primary responsibility of ours. And I also, one of the great stories of the last 20 years has been the academic performance improvement of student athletes who now graduate at a rate that, for the most part, across all three divisions and every demographic, is higher than the graduation rates for non-student athletes. And I worry about the transfer portal. I make no bones about that. And one of the things we're currently doing is dramatically upscaling our ability to track academic performance and transfer activity, to have a much better handle on what's actually happening there, and to be able to make that data available to our schools and to our academic committees, so that we can make sure that, the courts basically said kids can transfer every year. It's not your call, NCAA. So in that world, we got to figure out a way to make sure that we're doing a really good job of paying attention to what's going on and helping develop policies and programs to make adjustments if it turns out that it has the kind of negative consequences some people believe it may.
President Baker, thank you for being here today. And as a referee, I appreciate all the work you've done in our space. But we've had great concern.
What sport do you referee?
Football. But we've heard great concern over the future of collegiate Olympic sports at the Division I institutions, and that'll be a subject for our next panel. But over the past several months, at least 21 Division I teams have reportedly been eliminated. We understand a partnership exists between the NCAA and the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee. How is the NCAA leveraging this partnership with the USOPC to protect and encourage preservation of both the quantity and quality of Division I opportunities in collegiate Olympic sports? And what else can be done there?
So there were 1,400 current and former college athletes participating in the Olympics in Paris. What most people don't know is that 800 of them were competing for other countries. 600 of them were competing for the U.S. They won about 350 medals. About 270 of them won medals, so some of them won more than one. Women won 60% of the medals, and women won 60% of the golds. The Olympic sport movement in college sports in this country, which is the only country in the world that I'm aware of that doesn't spend any of its own money on its Olympic programs, is unique and has been enormously successful. And we marketed it like mad during the Olympics. And one of the reasons the fan database is important to me is I don't think we know enough about our Olympic sports fans. We know a lot about our football fans. We know a lot about our men's and women's basketball fans. We don't know anywhere near what we need to know about our Olympic sports fans. And I'll give you the best example I can give you of this is I went to the men's swimming and diving championship, which was right down the street at Indiana University last spring. And there were about 5,000 people there. It was a pretty good crowd. They were raucous. but we basically had the entire Olympic swim meet on the men's side participating from all the countries that participated, for the most part, not all of them, but huge numbers of them. And they broke a bunch of records, and Leon Marchand was every bit the maniac in that race, those races that he was a few months later in Paris. We had the U.S. Olympic trials at Lucas a few months after that, and about 30,000 people showed up for that. No offense meant to the U.S. Olympic swim team. They're great, but we had more Olympic swimmers at our men's swimming and diving championship than they had at Lucas. The difference was people knew about it. And I think one of the reasons we need to be a lot more aggressive about and strategic about how we market, sell fans on Olympic sports and collegiate institutions is because their fans are there. But if they don't know about it, we're not going to get them. And the fact that this really is, a lot of people call the men's and women's swimming and diving championship at the NCAA the fastest meets in the world every year. We have not done a good job of selling that and marketing it and finding those fans. And we should do it, because the more fans we find, the more opportunities there are to create revenue, and the more opportunities there are to create revenue, the more opportunities there are to create opportunities. And I think that's a big opportunity for everybody. John?
Good morning. John Alger, president of American University and the Patriot League. So I want to take us back for a moment to the educational mission. As colleges are striving to refocus many of us on that educational mission, there's been increasing discussion amongst many of us about the educational value and relevance of athletics. You think about building these skills that we care about, like communications, teamwork, leadership, problem solving, et cetera. So what do you think of the possibility of either academic credit or other curricular recognition for athletics participation?
That's a really great question. Where's Gabe? Gabe has an opinion on that. I've read about it a couple times. I think that's a really interesting issue for the membership to discuss. I don't pretend to have enough knowledge on that to offer. I don't know how you'd figure it out from a curricular point of view. But I certainly believe, as I said in my earlier remarks, that the lessons people learn playing sports are wildly undervalued and underappreciated, and they're a really big deal.
I could just follow up on that, because you and I were talking before this all started about experiential learning.
Yeah.
The co-op model at Northeastern in particular, as well as places like Cincinnati and Drexel, have promoted over the years. And I always looked at athletics as the ultimate experiential learning opportunity. So from that standpoint, and when you think about co-op or experiential learning, it really seems to fit. And if we give credit to kids who do co-op, maybe there's an opportunity to do the same with athletics.
Honestly, I'm a pretty easy sell on that one. But that is something that would have to come from the membership, and it would have to be something that was supported by the academic community as well as by the athletic community. I mean, I'll tell you one more story. I went to the D2 men's basketball Final Four, or Elite Eight, which was down in southern Indiana. And I went there for two reasons. Number one, I wanted to see Nova Southeastern play, which is coached by Jim Crutchfield, and a lot of people think it's the most interesting basketball team at any level in the country. Number two, I wanted to see DJ Guest play, who was playing for Dominguez Hills out of LA, because he's on our D2 Student Advisory Council, and I love the kid. By the way, the final between Dominguez and Nova was one of the best basketball games I've also ever seen, this D2 game. But I spent about the entire second half of Nova's game against Assumption sitting with DJ who was there with his teammates to watch Nova because they knew they were going to play him in the finals if they got there. And I said, what are you going to do? These guys average over 100 points a game. They, their record's 44-0. I mean, they've just been whacking the bejesus out of everybody. And he said, we have a plan. And I said, well, what is it? And so he said, well, we're not going to try and run with them because nobody can run with them, but we play really good half-court defense, and we're going to move our half-court defense up to the center line, right? So we're going to be picking them up the second they come over midcourt. And I said, well, what if they do this? And he said, well, we're going to do this. And I said, what if you do that? They're going to do that. And I mean, he didn't appreciate what he was doing, but what he was doing was giving me a strategy based on their strengths and weaknesses and Nova's strengths and weaknesses and how they were going to go about attacking them and taking them out of their game. And Nova beat Assumption, by the way, 108-99. I mean, their games are track meets. And the final score of the D2 championship, which was Dominguez Hills against Nova, was 75-74. And what he had said to me was, if we hold them to less than 80 points, we can win. And I said, you're never going to hold them to less than 80 points. And not only, and to me, it was an experiential example of, strategy development, process development, execution, adjustment. Nova was unbeatable and they damn near lost. And I don't think people, if you haven't been around a lot of sports teams, I think sometimes people underappreciate just how much experiential learning is involved there. And again, I think that's got to come from the academy. I don't think that can come from us, but I'm an easy sell on the idea that there's a tremendous amount of learning associated with sports.
President Baker, of course, you know this, but a lot of people don't know that the NCAA has no authority for the sport of FBS football, gets not a dime of its revenues, and yet has all the responsibility for football national costs. 5 years ago, the Knight Commission, as you know, recommended the creating a new governing entity for FBS football that would be separate from the NCAA. And it seems that that recommendation is probably more timely than ever today. So my question is, in your view, why should the NCAA remain accountable for the sport of FBS football since the NCAA receives $0 of revenue from the sport?
We don't spend a lot of money on FBS football. It is certainly part of our governance process, and we pay the expenses when people come to Indianapolis for in-person meetings. I think what the folks in our world would say is the governance structure is one that involves institutions that are members, and there is, in some respects, value to having what I would describe as a holistic approach to how we do playing rules and organizational decision making. Part of the reason we went with RefQuest was because RefQuest had a really good program for football, not just FBS football, but FCS football and D2 football and D3 football. And there's a lot of linkage between D1, D2, and D3 football, which folks up and down that portfolio would agree with. And the two biggest expenses the NCAA has are scholarship distributions, revenue distribution to the membership, and championships. And that they are the biggest expenses by a mile. Nothing else is even close. Those were about $1.4 billion, $1.5 billion on the revenue side. Those two pieces alone get you close to $1 billion. I don't think the expense that we incur managing the engagement that takes place between and among the subject matter experts in football is a terribly significant expense or a burden, and there's real benefit to having all of the folks who play football under the same roof when it comes to rulemaking and decisions about the future and the present of the game. So I don't really have a problem with it. And I honestly, I think most folks in the membership feel that way too.
Charlie, thanks for coming and spending some time with us. I'm Kirk Schultz, the president, current president, former president at Washington State University. So we appreciated when you came out to Pullman and spent some time with our student athletes and our coaches a year or two ago. Love to maybe continue our conversation around governance. And recently, I know you all and the NCAA is very involved and engaged around changing the Division I governance model. And the most recent proposal out there decreases the size of two key groups, the D1 Board of Directors and the proposed administrative group. At the same time, the newly proposed model shifts even more power and votes to the Power 4 conferences. The commission certainly has been a strong advocate of having independent directors on many of these particular groups. And while we recognize this as a membership decision, really love to hear your opinion on whether adding independent directors to the new D1 governing boards would help provide some additional objective decision-making for the greater good of all of its members.
So let me just start with the first part, which is the governance piece generally. I've spent my career in healthcare and state government. Pretty complicated decision-making organizations. They're like a one-person shop compared to the organization and structure of Division I at the NCAA. I said this before, so I'm not saying anything I haven't said before, but one of the main reasons for wanting to simplify and shrink in some cases the Division I governance structure was to create more accountability, not less. There are enough committees and enough process and enough people involved in D1 governance at the NCAA that it's pretty easy for nobody to be accountable for anything. And I've asked lots of questions of lots of people since I got this job. And, why did we make this decision? Why didn't we make this decision? Why did it take so long to make this decision, et cetera, et cetera? And the answer I get is this, that wasn't our fault. That happened here. That died there. This was here. They made that decision. And, one of the things about crowds is, people can hide in crowds. And there was just a lot of this, not my fault, not my problem. I didn't do it. It wasn't me, right? Even though you may have been the chair of the committee that theoretically had the most responsibility for it. And so part of and I get the fact that having less representation in the room means, fewer people involved. But the flip side of that is those folks are going to be accountable to the people that they are representing when they sit in those meetings. And I think it will give us a more accountable structure than we have now, and probably one that will be able to make decisions in a time frame that's more consistent with the way the world's working these days. The working group we have has 10 FBS people on it and 8 FCS and 1 AAA people on it. They're going to continue to meet and discuss this stuff. I'll take the independent director issue back to them and make that part of the dialogue. But I think generally speaking, the role of the A4, A5, whatever terminology people want to use for them, given the scale and the importance that they play and generally our ability to be successful, I do think they should have a bigger voice at the table. But I think the other voices matter too. And part of what we're trying to figure out here is how to create a dynamic where if you're at that table, your voice matters and you're going to be held accountable for the decisions that you make. Because the ability of everybody to just hide in the crowd over the history is really unhealthy. And all cards on the table. And Kevin, where's Kevin? He'll vouch for me on this one. one of the things I said at one of my earlier meetings with staff was I said, you guys blame the membership for decisions you think were bad decisions. They blame you for decisions they think were bad decisions. We can't have this. We can't have this. Everybody needs to own the decisions that they make. But if you're so complicated that it's really easy for everybody not to own anything, that's a problem. And that's kind of where we've been. So look, like I said, I've been around a lot of distributed decision-making models, and I'm fine with that. But this one needs to change.
President Baker, it's great to have you here. My name is Kendall Spencer. I'm a former SAC chair. Kind of going off of what Kirk was discussing with the governance model, we recognize the House settlement does not address the college athletes' role in governance at the conference or national level. In the NCAA's newly proposed Division I governance model, though, student athlete representation would be increased for football, men's basketball, or women's basketball athletes with meaningful experiences, namely for athletes on financial aid and who enjoy significant playing time already. Adding athletes from these revenue sports to the proposed governing board is a positive aspect, but the proposed board representation is limited to only 3 athlete votes. Given the weighted voting for Power 4 conferences, the athletes' votes will make up a total of only 12%. So what we're curious about is, do you believe the changes adequately accommodate the student athlete role in decision-making within Division I governance?
Well, the 3 student athletes are going to have more votes as a group, as a block, than many conferences. I mean, remember, this is a much smaller board and a much smaller administrative committee than we had historically. It's a significant increase in the voice of student athletes generally in our decision-making model. And I think, so what I would say is it's directionally correct, but there's no law that says we can't change it at some point down the road if we think it needs to be more. I think it's really important that we get, that we have a process to make sure we get, kids on this thing who really want to be there and have their peers' support to be there. But I think this is directionally the right way to go. And I can tell you that it'll be a much bigger voice than they've had historically in our decision-making by a wide margin.
Hi, President Baker. I'm Christine Copper. I'm the faculty athletic rep at the Naval Academy. I also currently serve on the Division I Council. And I want to go back to the
Congratulations on the Army-Navy game.
Thank you. It was an exciting year for us.
Yeah.
I'd like to go back to the question about FBS football. And, you were asked about having a separate governance model for them and some of the expenses that get covered for them by the NCAA, even though the revenue that they make from the CFP doesn't necessarily translate back to this NCAA, right? They own and run their own championship. There are a lot of costs associated with running football that the NCAA pays for, and especially in the litigation. And then also in the most recent, the damages from the settlement, I think about 75% of the $2.8 billion, if I'm right, is going to FBS football players. So there's a lot of costs that the NCAA is paying for football. How much longer are we going to be okay with that? Or should we, as a membership, is there any way to get the college football playoff to start supporting more of the cost for FBS football? And also in the distribution in the membership, schools get credit for having football programs and spending money on football scholarships, but again, are not paying some of the national costs for the sport. So how do we reconcile all that? I think it's a beautiful business model the college football playoff has, right? They get to make a lot of money, but they don't have to pay all of their expenses.
I guess I'd say a couple things. One is the damages are about the rule. And the rule applied to all sports. didn't apply just to football. It didn't apply to men's basketball. It applied to all sports. That's what people sued on, the rule. The same is true with the scholarship piece. It's the rule. And the non-FBS schools had more than enough votes to get rid of that rule, both of them, plus the other ones, if they wanted to. It was about the rule. And there's no better example of everybody going like this than having conversations with people about why we ended up where we ended up on the rules that were associated with this settlement. So I sort of start with, where the money goes, that's up to the judge and the plaintiffs. Okay. That's not up to the schools. That's up to the judge and the plaintiffs. And I think one of the things that people need to understand about that is and I've had this debate and discussion with lots of folks in the membership. It wasn't football who created the legal challenges and the litigation. It was the rules. And everybody voted for him and everybody stuck with him. Now I think the settlement is fair. On our end, meaning, the 2.86 was the negotiated agreement that we came to on the back end. The structure going forward was also negotiated with the plaintiffs. It will provide literally thousands of new scholarships. And I fully expect that many of those scholarships are going to be in sports other than football. The baseball limit. This limit first, before I even got the job, or before I actually started, it was after I was announced. If you were to say to me, what was the number one issue people came at me with? It was the baseball scholarship limit, which is 11.5 equivalents on teams that typically have 30, 35 kids. And if you look at the suit that was filed in Colorado on this, it's about the Tennessee baseball team, because not one kid on the Tennessee baseball team, which won a national championship last year, had a full scholarship. The fact that the CFP is not part of the NCAA is just, that is the world we live in, okay? But I root for the CFP to do really well. And the reason I root for the CFP to do really well is, in many cases, the money that's made by football supports lots of other sports that I care about a lot. And I try not to break these things up into pieces in isolation, because I don't see them that way. And I know the people who are on campus don't. The people on campus want their football program to do really well, because their football program makes lots of other things possible. And that's not just true at the power schools. That's true at a lot of schools. Now, there are some schools and some conferences that have turned basketball into a machine. As a former basketball player, I love that. I think that's great. But more often than not, the football program is usually the biggest source of revenue. And I think the numbers historically have been, football generates somewhere between 70 and 75% of the revenue and spends 20, 25% of the money. And the other 50% pays for all the other sports. And I don't think that's a bad thing. And I don't think the lawsuits, as much as they've been talked about as being about football, were about football. There's no lawsuit about football. The lawsuit is about the rules.
So I think you just gave one of the most cogent arguments for why it's okay. But on the other hand, if the revenue portfolio was with the NCAA was more balanced and included those revenues from football, wouldn't that be much more enabling for all the good that NCAA could do for all the other sports? Because right now I'm convinced what comes out of the CFP, former president of Florida State University, president emeritus at Penn State University. That money that's coming out of the NCAA, I think it's hard to make, that's coming out of college football playoff. It's hard to not see that going to advanced football, whereas the NCAA has a broader portfolio with all college sports. So even though you make a very cogent argument there about why it might be okay, because it's the rule, and I do appreciate that, it seems to me you would do a much better job of supporting college athletics if your revenue portfolio was better balanced.
It's funny, where's Bubba? If you were to ask the basketball committee, which he chairs, if we spend enough money on our basketball championship, he would probably say no. And he would argue that the basketball championship generates all the revenue that supports the rest of what goes on at the NCAA. Not quite true, but I get it. And I think the same conversation goes on college campuses. And I look, I think the question you guys are asking is one that the schools have been asked, and I feel like they've kind of answered it. And I do believe that many of them going forward are hoping to do very well in the football space so that they have the resources to support a lot of their other programming. If you think about a lot of the big football schools that are out there, they're not the ones that are cutting back on their Olympic sports. And the reason they're not cutting back on their Olympic sports is they want to keep them, and they know they're a big part of their brand and their success, and that they're great for their kids. But my goal was to find a way out of this legal situation that we were in that I thought would do well by the student athletes we could afford, and would make it possible for the NCAA and the schools that are part of the NCAA across all three divisions to continue to operate and be successful. And there's no question it's a tight fit for all of us. But in the end, I think you play the hand you have. And I would say that the folks on the basketball committee have been really good about making sure that the resources that their tournaments, men's and women's basketball tournament, by the way, the men's and women's tournament do well. Baseball tournament does well. The softball tournament does well. Volleyball is growing. There are going to be opportunities for us to continue to broaden our revenue base going forward. But we are very similar to those schools you talk about, because our big machine has been our basketball tournaments. And they support a lot of their stuff.
President Baker, Amy Huchthausen, former commissioner of the America East Conference, located in the great city of Boston. Good to have you here today. We'll switch gears a little bit. My question's more on focus on enforcement. Enforcement functions related both to NIL compensation and the cap on the new institutional payments made directly to athletes will be outsourced moving forward. I know there's some news that broke last night. My question is not related to that at all. But with that shifting, what will the NCAA's priorities in enforcement be in other areas? And how will that enforcement arm effectively provide accountability around those other priorities? So
I'm glad you asked this question, because this piece is not, I don't think, as well understood as maybe as it should be. The whole reason, we were defendants for the back damages. That's why the plaintiffs wanted us in front of a judge. The power conferences were plaintiffs for the go forward. That's why the plaintiffs wanted them in front of the judge, because they want to be able to monitor the actual implementation and execution on the forward state and monitor the back damage payments. And so the power conference's response to that is to create an entity, the College Sports Commission. And by the way, everybody's doing this contingent on the judge's decision. The judge hasn't issued a decision yet, so we'll see. But The point behind that was to have an entity that would oversee the cap management system and the third-party NIL system, have rules associated with both, create enforcement parameters and penalties for violating those rules under the rubric of what would be the theoretical injunction, where the plaintiff attorneys would have the ability to pay attention to what was going on. The special master appointed by the court would have the ability to make sure everybody was complying with the federal rules, in the arbitration process, which has to be approved by all the defendants and the plaintiff attorneys, would be there to settle disputes, all underneath an injunction, which is a big change in the way that's worked historically. But I think, as I said in my opening statement, I think has more legal frame to it than the way we do this stuff on the NCAA side now. So the way I've shorthanded this is I've said this process, if the court approves the settlement and creates the injunction, will be the vehicle through which most of the so-called money issues get addressed. But things like academic eligibility and academic performance and progress to graduation, sports betting, other forms of fraud, health and safety violations on campus, that kind of stuff, that's still going to belong to the NCAA. But the stuff associated with the money is going to be inside this injunction. And I think that's going to have, in some ways, more capacity to be successful than us doing this under, this is a law. I mean, this is federal law with an arbitration process, a special master, and oversight. I think it's actually going to be more sustainable than what we do on our end.
If I could ask a follow-up for the other stuff that will still be under the jurisdiction of the NCAA.
Yep.
Do you anticipate any improvements to that system? Because the membership will be operating under two, and for the reasons that you said, that makes sense.
I think, look, the CSC's got to launch and get going, and then we'll see where the opportunities are to benefit from their approach to this stuff. That's absolutely a TBD, but it's not clear at this point how exactly that would work.
Okay, we've got time for two more questions, Eric and then Shantiana.
So the history of college athletics has had a lot of significant issues that are related to equity, both race and gender. And we realize there's a constitutional framework for the NCAA on these issues, but we're curious about your overall views of equity issues in college athletics. And just to put a point on it, we know there are schools that are making decisions about the distribution of internal funds, say, in some cases, 75% for men versus 25% for women. So it's a real and returning issue, but perhaps you could address it broadly first in terms of your views on the importance of equity issues going forward.
Well, obviously, part of my approach to this generally, and part of the reason why I meet with all the conferences every year, there's that kind of equity too. The high performer, high revenue schools, and then the schools that are, in my opinion, teaching kids a lot of the same lessons who don't have the TV contracts and all the rest. I want to make sure we do what we need to do to make sure they're all successful. I think Title IX is, I'm on the record having asked the previous administration on a number of occasions to give us some guidance on how to think about Title IX in an NIL world. Unfortunately, it didn't make the cut with respect to the things they were focused on. I think the schools generally have been pretty involved with a lot of the law firms and attorneys who are experts in this space, and they all recognize and appreciate that their programming however they put it together, has got to qualify and comply with Title IX. And Title IX, as you all know, is like a ladder. It's got a whole bunch of different things in it, all of which translate ultimately into kind of an overall compliance. It's not just scholarships, it's scholarships plus a whole bunch of other things. I think but I really do think that is so school specific, depending upon the nature of their programming and how they operate and what sports they're in and what sports they're not in, that the decision making around Title IX belongs there. It doesn't, I mean, it's impossible to think about what a Title IX policy for 1,100 schools would be at the NCAA level. But, we have advocated for guidance from the feds on a number of occasions and, unfortunately haven't been successful on that.
Thank you for being here. I'm Shantiana Keys, former Division II National SAC member. You've mentioned the House settlement.
Where did you play and what did you play?
Georgia College in the Peach Belt Conference, and played basketball.
Were you a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5?
2 and 3.
2 and 3.
Yeah.
Okay.
We've talked a lot, or you mentioned the House settlement and the damages. Last August, we wrote the D1 Board of Directors to urge them to reconsider an aspect of the internal payment plan for funding those damages. And specifically, we wanted to protect the Academic Performance Fund from being cut $10 million a year to fund those damages. And you mentioned the graduation achievements and how necessary they were to the revenue distribution. It is our understanding that during the payment period, the D1 board, in tandem with the Board of Governors, has the authority to modify this internal plan. So do we understand correctly that modifications can be made? And if so, what are your thoughts about restoring the full distribution for academic units?
If you don't mind, since that's a really technical and detailed question, can I have your permission to get back to you on that one? I will get back to you. Okay.
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 All right. All right. That's great.
I didn't think we cut that fund, so I want to find out why you think we did.
I appreciate the candor, no question about it. And thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. And unfortunately, we've reached the end of this particular session. And on behalf of the full commission, I'd like to offer my thanks for your presence. And, hopefully we'll see you again.
I think the first question you should ask my good friend from North Carolina is why he thinks the Duke basketball team is so good.
That would be an open-ended question. But please know that, our commission remains focused in its mission to prioritize education, health, safety, and the success of college athletes. And your time with us certainly demonstrates a common ground for both our organizations. At this point, we are going to take a break and get ready for session 2, which should start at 11 a.m. So once again, thank you very much.
Appreciate the chance to be here.